I battled alongside the humans and learned the true meaning of fear. The alarm was already screaming when I reached my station. Not our alarm, theirs. The docking bay feeds lit up in sequence, and for 3 full seconds every officer on the conclave observation deck simply stood there, watching the thing come in. It was enormous. Not in the way a Kreth displacement frigate was enormous. That cold and geometric enormity, designed to communicate that you were already calculated and already losing. This ship was enormous, the way a living thing is enormous. Asymmetrical, dented in places, covered in markings that my translation matrix could not immediately parse because they were not informational. They were decorative. Someone had painted a face on the hull, a large, grinning face with all its teeth showing, and beneath the face, in letters that my matrix identified as a personal name rather than a vessel designation, Carthage. I had been studying human transmissions for 6 of their years. I had written 4 separate reports on their communication patterns, their biological rhythms, their recorded conflicts with other species, and their considerable conflicts with each other. I had presented twice before the Conclave Observer Corps. I had been chosen for this assignment because I was, by every institutional measure available, the most prepared Vethari alive for first extended contact with a human military unit. I was not prepared. The ship docked without requesting permission. Not aggressively. There was no posturing in the approach, no territorial signal, no communication burst my matrix could read as dominance display. The Carthage identified an available docking collar and used it, the way a large animal sits in a chair, because the chair was there and it was tired. The clamps engaged with a resonance that moved through the station's hull, the umbilical extended, and then, before any formal protocol had been initiated, before any diplomatic exchange had been proposed, a hatch opened and they came out. They were singing. My translation matrix processed the audio and offered me, in flat Vethari phonetics, the following. A human female named Jolene was being urgently implored not to take another person's romantic partner. This was apparently urgent enough to require harmony vocals. 2 of the humans carrying large sealed containers of what my matrix identified as mass driver ammunition were providing those harmony vocals. A third was producing rhythmic sounds with his mouth that my matrix cataloged as cultural rhythm expression, non-linguistic, and then offered no further assistance. They were unloading weapons and singing about Jolene. I stood at the observation window and I watched them, and I had no framework to apply. I had a prepared greeting. I had a protocol sequence. I had 17 pages of briefing notes and a translation module I had calibrated over 3 weeks. All of it belonged to a different situation, a situation where the incoming military unit behaved the way military units behave, with the organized, purposeful severity that signals readiness and communicates competence. These creatures were carrying ammunition in the key of D major. The wrongness began there. Wrong was the only category I had for a thing that fit no existing category. They were not behaving like a military unit. They were not behaving like a diplomatic party. They were behaving the way my navigator-bonded Orvin used to behave on rest cycles, loose and warm and present in her body, not performing a function, but simply existing in the pleasure of existing. I had watched her do that, and found it one of the most distinctly Vethari qualities I had ever observed. These humans were doing it while carrying ammunition. The senior officer came out last. Captain Yara Osei. My briefing file had her name, her rank, her service record. The file was 4 pages long. 4 pages was what the Conclave Intelligence Corps had compiled on a decorated military officer with 14 years of active service and 3 commendations, which told me less about her and considerably more about how seriously the Conclave had been taking humanity until approximately 19 hours ago, when a Kreth displacement fleet had been sighted, moving toward the Mareth corridor, and someone had remembered that the humans had offered assistance 6 months prior, and we had filed that offer under pending review, and forgotten it entirely. She walked out of the Carthage and looked at the docking bay the way you look at a room you intend to rearrange. Her eyes moved across the space with a quality of attention that was professional without being formal. She took in the conclave officers at the observation window, the station architecture, the other vessels at dock. Then her eyes found me at the window. She raised one hand with the palm facing out, and all 5 fingers spread. I raised one of my anterior limbs, in what I hoped was approximate imitation. She smiled. Humans smile with their teeth. I had known this from the transmissions, and had classified it as an expression of warmth and welcome, in person, at this distance. With the painted grinning face of the Carthage behind her, I understood something the transmissions had not conveyed. The smile was warmth. It was also something older than warmth. Something that had not entirely departed from the evolutionary moment when baring teeth served a different communicative function. She walked toward the diplomatic corridor, and I moved to meet her. The corridor was 112 meters long. In that distance, I revised my assessment of the situation 4 times. Before we were halfway, I understood my briefing materials were technically accurate and experientially useless. Before she was 20 meters away, I understood I had been preparing for a version of this encounter that did not match the encounter approaching me. By the time she extended her hand, I knew the next several months would require me to build an entirely new framework from direct observation rather than from anything the archive contained. I extended my tentacle cluster. She took it and pressed firmly, once, and released. My briefing file had described this gesture. It had not mentioned how warm human hands are. Startlingly, immediately warm, like a creature that runs hotter than its environment and makes no apology for it. She looked at me with the real kind of curiosity, not the managed professional curiosity of a diplomat navigating a first encounter, the genuine kind, the kind a creature produces when it has found something it actually finds interesting and cannot perform otherwise. "Do they bleed?" she asked. I processed the question. "The Kreth?" "Yes. All living things bleed," I said. "The Kreth have a circulatory fluid, blue-green in standard visible light spectrum." She nodded, slowly. The way you nod when an answer confirms something you already suspected, rather than telling you something new. "Good," she said. She said it quietly. Not to me. Not exactly. The way people say things to themselves when they are closing a door, settling something internal, picking something up they had set down and choosing to carry it again. Then she produced the teeth-baring expression again and asked me to show her to the Tactical Operations Center. I walked with her through the main corridor. Her crew fell in around us with the easy, unstructured informality of people who have worked together long enough that formation is unnecessary. A few were still humming fragments of the Jolene song. A young man with a broad face and careful eyes introduced himself as Corporal Dawit Tesfaye and said it was genuinely nice to meet me, and offered me something from a small packet he was carrying. "Chip?" he said. My matrix translated, "Thin sliced starch, fried, heavily salted." I declined. He shrugged and ate several himself. I noticed the packet bore a warning symbol from the Human Hazard Classification System. I asked what it indicated. "Extreme heat," he said, in the tone someone uses to describe mild weather. I looked at the chip he was eating. I looked at him. He showed no observable distress. He appeared to be enjoying himself. The wrongness deepened. That evening, I filed a preliminary report. 3 sentences. The humans have arrived. They are not what the briefing materials indicated. I am revising my assessment framework and will submit a full update within 48 hours. My supervisor responded in 11 minutes. Please elaborate on what specifically was not as indicated. I stared at the response for a long time. I had no answer that would have been satisfying in 48 hours. I was beginning to suspect I would not have a complete answer for considerably longer than that. I accessed the intelligence archive and pulled the full human military classification file. I had read it during preparation, the way you read background material, as context rather than as primary information. I read it again now in the quiet of my observation quarters, while sounds from the human crew's evening gathering drifted through the ventilation system. They were laughing about something. Someone was losing a card game based on the escalating volume. Someone was playing an instrument I could not identify, low and continuous, a sound that seemed designed not to communicate information, but simply to occupy air comfortably. The file's header notation read, "Species classification, predator. Pre-sapient instinct retention, confirmed." I had read that before and filed it as an interesting evolutionary footnote. I read it again now and understood it was a warning about precisely what I was currently dealing with. I closed the file. The laughter continued down the corridor. I did not sleep well. The next morning, Captain Osei sat across from me in the briefing room with her hands flat on the table and asked me to tell her everything about how the Kreth fought. "Not strategy," she said. Not fleet formations. What the Kreth wanted when they fought. What winning looked like from inside their model. I told her. 11 years of systematic territorial displacement, system by system, unhurried, geometrically precise. The conclave doctrine of perimeter formation, negotiated civilian withdrawal, managed resource loss, the rhythm of it, the patience of it, the way the Kreth moved like something that had already calculated the endpoint and was executing the path with the confidence of a system that had never been surprised. She listened without a single interruption. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the tactical display between us. Nobody has gone through the middle, she said, not a question. I said the center of a Kreth formation was heavily defended by design. Sure, she said, but if you never try the middle, the heavy defense costs them nothing. The defense that never gets tested is just extra weight. She looked at the display for another moment. She said. Just that. The Kreth fleet was 3 days from the Marath corridor. I had 3 days to figure out what that single syllable meant. I spent those days following Captain Osei and her senior staff through their preparation. I watched them run drills in the docking bay. I watched them reconfigure the ship's weapons systems in ways my engineering matrix flagged as unconventional at least 14 times. I watched Corporal Tesfaye eat 6 more packets of the extreme heat chips and remain in perfect health, which I was beginning to find personally instructive in ways I could not yet articulate. On the second evening, I found Captain Osei in the corridor outside the tactical room, standing at a viewport with her arms crossed and her weight on one leg, looking at the stars. She was not doing anything. She was simply standing there and looking. "Can you not sleep?" I asked. "I sleep fine," she said. "Then what are you doing?" She thought about it. "Getting ready," she said. I asked what that meant specifically. What was she doing, internally, to prepare? She considered this. You know how before a storm, the air changes? Pressure drops. Animals go quiet. Everything holds its breath. I said I was familiar with the phenomenon. "I'm doing that," she said, to myself. She went to bed 20 minutes later. I stayed at the viewport. The stars were the same stars I had been looking at my entire career. The dark was the same dark. But I stayed there for a long time, aware of something I could not name, some shift in the quality of the air that existed only in my perception, that might have been nothing at all. Might have been. I filed my second preliminary report that night. 2 sentences. The humans are preparing. I do not yet have the vocabulary to describe what they are preparing to become. My supervisor did not respond to that one. 3 days later, the Kreth fleet arrived, and everything I thought I knew about war stopped being true. The Kreth fleet came out of fold space in perfect formation, and every conclave commander on that channel responded exactly as doctrine required. 7 conclave vessels spread into the defensive perimeter arc, the formation that had been the standard answer to Kreth aggression for 11 years, the overlapping fields of fire, the protected civilian transit lanes, the no obvious weakness geometry that was designed not to win engagements but to not lose them catastrophically. It was a good formation. It had worked, in its own specific way, for a decade, where working meant minimizing losses while still, ultimately, conceding ground. The Kreth fleet formed up and halted. They always halted. This was the known rhythm. 6 to 8 hours of calculation, identifying the load-bearing element of the perimeter that, when removed, caused the rest to become untenable. Then the displacement maneuver, patient and precise, and the perimeter would hold until it could not, and then the organized retreat would begin, system by system. 11 years of the same sequence. The conclave had learned to run that sequence with the minimal possible loss. The Kreth had learned that the conclave would always run that sequence. It had become, by this point, less a battle and more an arrangement. I was at my liaison station on the bridge of the Carthage when Captain Osei looked at the perimeter formation on her tactical display. She looked at it for 4 seconds. She looked at the Kreth formation for 2 more. Then she said, I had spent 3 days thinking about that syllable. I had discussed it with Corporal Tesfaye, who had been unhelpful in an endearing way. I had gone through the human military transmission archive and cross-referenced every context in which that particular vocalization appeared. I had developed a working theory. The theory was that when Captain Osei said, she had already decided something, and the syllable was the sound of the decision landing. "All hands," she said, and her voice was level in the careful way that things are level when they have been made that way deliberately. "Combat approach. We are going to the center." The bridge went quiet. Not the quiet of shock, not the quiet of hesitation. A different kind entirely. I watched it happen as a physical change in the room, the quality of attention on that bridge shifting from ordinary operational alertness to something I did not have a word for. They became precise. They became economical. Every unnecessary process suspended so that the essential ones could run without competition. Their eyes went to their stations and did not leave. The people I had been watching for the past weeks, the people who sang during ammunition transfers and played card games and argued passionately about the health of a plant in the hydroponics bay, those people did not disappear. But they went somewhere interior, and what remained at each station was something simpler and more specific, and entirely aimed. I had never seen anything like it. On the communication channels, the conclave commanders were reacting. Admiral Vress's voice had the strained quality of someone watching a situation evolve in a direction they had not prepared for. He was requesting confirmation of the Carthage's heading. Captain Ose confirmed the heading. A silence followed on the channel that had texture and weight, the weight of institutional structures meeting something their models had not accounted for. The Carthage broke formation and accelerated toward the Kreth fleet, alone. I want to be precise about what I observed on that bridge during the engagement, because I have reviewed my notes on it many times, and I believe it is one of the most important things I witnessed in 14 years of professional fieldwork. It was not what I had expected. I had studied human combat behavior extensively. I knew about the physiological processes, the adrenaline conversion, the narrowing of cognitive focus toward immediate threat response priorities. I knew this the way you know weather patterns in regions you have not visited, with intellectual accuracy and no experiential reference. What I had not understood from the reading was what it looks like from outside when it is actually happening. It is not loud. This was the first and most disorienting thing. I had expected urgency, the frantic energy of creatures reacting to an acute threat. What I found instead was a stillness that was unlike any other stillness I could reference. It was not rest. It was not peace. It was a stillness with direction. A stillness that was entirely occupied, every part of it busy with something invisible, with the internal processes of creatures who had learned to take what wanted to make them frantic and convert it into something that could aim precisely at a target. The first Kreth volley hit our forward shields, and the Carthage did not stop. My liaison matrix was running the tactical calculation continuously, and the calculation was not offering comfort. The Kreth center position had defensive armaments optimized for exactly this approach vector. Based on every engagement dataset from 11 years of recorded conflict, a vessel of the Carthage's class approaching on this heading would not survive contact with the center formation. The numbers were that clear. The numbers were based on how every other ship had approached. The Carthage was not approaching the way every other ship had. It was moving in ways I had not known a vessel of that mass could move, rolling and pitching and changing angle in sequences that did not match any evasion algorithm in the Conclave Tactical Archive, because they were not from the archive. At some point before this engagement, someone had sat down with 11 years of Kreth weapons discharge data and mapped the gaps, the intervals between volleys, the fractional delays in the targeting array rotation cycles, the small imperfections that existed, not because the Kreth system was flawed, but because no system is perfect, and no one had previously looked for the imperfections, because the consensus was that you did not approach the center, and therefore the imperfections in the center's coverage were irrelevant to everyone. Someone on this ship had looked for them. Someone on this ship had done the math that produced this specific series of movements: the roll at 6 seconds, the pitch correction at 9, the lateral drift at 14, all of it threading through gaps in the fire coverage that were real, but narrow enough that they were only accessible if you knew exactly where they were, and had practiced the sequences until the practice was indistinguishable from instinct. I looked at Captain Ose. She was in the center of the bridge with her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes moving between displays with the unhurried economy of someone completing a familiar task, not performing confidence, not managing anxiety, simply present in the work the way you are present in work you have rehearsed completely and then set aside so that your body can do it without your mind getting in the way. She looked comfortable. Comfortable. The Carthage had reached the outer edge of the Kreth center formation. The Kreth vessels there began to reorient individually, pivoting to engage at shorter range, and watching that happen I understood the plan for the first time in its complete shape. Because Kreth vessels reorienting individually means they have moved from executing a coordinated system to making individual reactive decisions. They are no longer running the model. They are responding to a present they did not plan for. Individual reaction is slower than pre-positioned anticipation. Reaction lives in the present. Anticipation lives in the future. Captain Osei had built this engagement in the future and was executing it there. Fire, she said. The Carthage had been reconfigured during the preparation period in ways my engineering matrix had flagged as unconventional 14 times. I understood now what unconventional meant in this context. The ship had removed its long-range defensive capacity, its flanking arrays, its redundant shielding protocols, and redirected that power into concentrated forward offensive output. The Carthage was no longer a balanced warship. It was something more specific than a warship. A single focused instrument designed to do one thing with maximum commitment in the window available, before the window closed, and the survival calculations could worry about themselves afterward. The sound that followed is something I cannot translate accurately into Vethari. What I can say is that the primary Kreth coordination vessel, the hub of the fleet's shared tactical calculation network, took damage in the opening 90 seconds that disrupted its relay function. Without clean coordination, the Kreth fleet's most significant capability, the ability to run and share real-time tactical models across the entire fleet simultaneously, began to degrade. A degraded Kreth fleet is, it turns out, simply a collection of ships making individual decisions at individual speeds. The Carthage had turned their greatest strength into a liability in under 2 minutes. I watched the clock on my liaison display because I needed the duration for my report, and because the viewport was showing me things I needed a moment's distance from. 3 minutes and 40 seconds from the first contact with the center formation to the moment the engagement data shifted irrevocably in our favor. 3 minutes and 40 seconds of the Carthage doing what every model said was impossible, and doing it with the calm efficiency of someone who had checked the models and found a gap in them. Then the Kreth fleet did something it had not done in 11 years of conflict. It retreated. Not displaced. Not strategically repositioned. Retreated, using the emergency dispersion pattern, the response to a threat that the shared tactical calculation had not accounted for and could not immediately incorporate. In 11 years of recorded Conclave-Kreth conflict, this pattern had never appeared. In 11 years, it had never been necessary. The communication channels became a kind of structured chaos. Admiral Vress was in there, his voice carrying multiple things at once, some of which were about unauthorized action, and some of which were about outcomes that exceeded projections, and the particular quality of his voice was the quality of someone receiving something they had wanted very much, and not knowing where to put it. On the bridge of the Carthage, nobody was shouting. One person exhaled, long and controlled, from somewhere deep in the chest. Someone else made a short sound that existed somewhere between a word and the basic physical confirmation of continued existence. Corporal Tesfaye put his forehead down on his station console and held it there for exactly 3 seconds. I counted. Then he lifted it, straightened in his seat, and began the post-engagement systems diagnostic without looking away from the display. Captain Osei unclenched her hands. I had not seen them clench. They had been behind her back the entire engagement, and I had not thought to look at them. I looked now. Her knuckles, when she flexed her fingers slowly, were pale where the blood had been pressed out of them. She flexed them again, and the color returned, and she looked at her hands for a brief moment, and then she looked at me. "You okay?" she asked. I processed the question. "I am physically undamaged," I said. "That is not what I asked." I looked at my liaison display. I looked at the viewport, where the Kreth fleet was now a retreating scatter of shapes against the dark. I looked at the tactical calculation still running on my screen, the one that had very clearly said, unacceptable losses for 3 minutes and 40 seconds, while being wrong about everything. "No," I said. "I do not believe I am okay." She nodded, as if this was a reasonable answer. As if the correct response to watching your entire professional framework for understanding conflict become obsolete in under 4 minutes was simply to acknowledge it and proceed. "Rest cycle in 2 hours," she said. "Use it." She was already looking at the next display. I went back to my quarters and stood at the viewport and looked at the space where the Kreth fleet had been. My chromatophores were cycling through patterns I could not control, the visible markers of a state I could not name. I had spent 14 years as a professional observer. I had witnessed engagements in 3 conflict zones. I had documented 11 species in active conflict situations and produced assessments that were still referenced in the Conclave Military Intelligence Archive. Nothing I had written prepared me for what I had just watched. I touched the navigation console at my workstation, a habit I had developed 3 years ago. It did not help with anything practical. I did it anyway. Then I went to find Corporal Tesfaye. He was in the mess hall, eating, which I had come to understand was the default state for humans in any moment not actively requiring them to be somewhere else. He looked up when I came in and gestured at the bench across from him. I sat. He reached into his cargo pocket and produced a chip packet and set it on the table between us. I looked at it. The warning symbol was very clear. I took one. He watched me with the expression of someone witnessing a significant personal milestone. The sensation was immediate and precise. The heat moved through my oral cavity in a wave that my sensory matrix classified, accurately and inadequately, as a chemical irritant stimulus. My chromatophores shifted involuntarily toward the distress spectrum. I held still and waited for resolution. "It gets better," Corporal Tesfaye said. The wave continued for what I considered an unreasonable duration. Then it began, incrementally, to recede. What it left behind was not neutral. It was something warmer and stranger than neutral, a kind of heightened presence in the sensory pathways, as if the irritant had cleared a space that was now available for something else. "Why?" I managed. "Do you eat these things voluntarily?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He ate a chip himself, unhurried. "Because it feels good after," he said. "The pain feels good?" "No. Surviving the pain feels good." I looked at him. "You deliberately create a condition of distress in order to experience the relief of exiting that condition." He pointed at me. "Yes, exactly that. That is," I said, "an extremely inefficient system for generating positive sensation." He laughed, open and genuine, the kind of laugh that arrives without checking whether it is appropriate. "Yeah, probably," he said. "But after something tried to hurt you and didn't quite manage it, you feel more alive, more awake, like everything got sharper. Like you actually notice the fact of being here, which you usually don't, because being here is just the default state." He ate another chip. "These are like a small practice version of that." "A reminder," I said. "Exactly. Of what, specifically?" "That you're still here," he said. I sat with that answer. Around us, the mess hall held the quiet, warming sounds of a crew returning to themselves after an engagement. People eating, talking, existing in the uncomplicated warmth of continued existence. The card game had resumed in the corner. 2 people near the bulkhead were discussing the plant in the hydroponics bay with genuine concern. These were the same people who had been on that bridge less than 6 hours ago, going somewhere interior and becoming simple and precise and aimed. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Sure." "On the bridge, during the engagement, what happened to you, internally? What does that state feel like from inside?" He stopped chewing. He gave the question its full weight, which I had come to understand was a consistent quality in him. "You stop thinking about big stuff," he said after a moment. "Everything narrows. You are not thinking about your life, or what comes after, or what you should have done differently last week. You are only in the task, the exact thing, directly in front of you. That is the whole world." He paused. "Some people say it is the most peaceful they ever feel, right in the worst of it. Is it peace?" I said. "Or is it the absence of everything that is not necessary for immediate survival?" He looked at me with something between surprise and recognition. "Maybe," he said. "Those are the same thing." I ate another chip. The after settled, warmer, and stranger than neutral. I spent 2 days in the rest cycle watching the crew from a respectful distance. I watched them sleep and eat and play their card games with a competitive intensity completely disproportionate to the stated stakes. I watched them take care of each other in the continuous small ways that required no announcement. A cup of warm liquid placed at a station without being asked for. A hand briefly on a shoulder in the corridor. the specific quality of attention that means I know you are carrying something and you are not required to say so. On the evening of the second day, I found Captain Osei in her personal quarters with a physical book open in front of her. I had known humans used physical books. Seeing it in practice felt different from knowing it. There was something chosen about it, something that said this specific way of receiving information matters to me, in a way other ways do not. She looked up when I appeared in the doorway. "Sit down," she said. I was expecting this conversation. I sat. "I am trying to understand what makes humans function the way you function in conflict," I said. "I have observed the results. I do not yet understand the mechanism, what is actually happening, from inside, when you make a decision that every rational calculation says is too costly." She was quiet for a long moment. She picked up the book and set it back down. "Humans have been afraid for a very long time," she said. "We evolved in an environment where things were trying to eat us constantly. We were not the biggest, or the strongest, or the fastest. We were a medium-sized animal with a very large brain and a bad habit of standing upright in places with poor visibility." She paused. "For a long time, the fear response should have destroyed us. A species that afraid should not function under threat. But enough of our ancestors were in enough impossible situations that they developed something, not a solution to the fear, an addition to it." "The conversion," I said. She looked at me. "You have been thinking about this." "For 3 days." She nodded. "The fear arrives, same as it always did, same intensity, same speed. And then, in about half a second, it has to become something with a direction, something that picks a target instead of an exit. Fear looks for an exit. Anger picks a target. Anger is faster in exactly that one specific way. So on the bridge," I said, "during the engagement, you were afraid." "Extremely," she said. I could not see it. "You weren't supposed to," she said. "We didn't evolve to show fear to predators. We evolved to complete the conversion before it showed. The showing comes after, when the threat is over, when it is safe to put down what you were holding." She looked at her hands for a moment. "That is what the exhale is. On the bridge, when it was done, the fear, finally getting out. The long, controlled exhale, the forehead on the console, the pale knuckles unclenching. I had seen all of it, and catalogued it, and not understood what I was looking at. "I need to tell you something," I said. She looked up from her hands. "There is a Vethari navigator bonded to my navigational signature," I said. "Her name is Orvin. We were bonded when I received my commission 11 years ago. The Kreth displaced her moon 3 years ago. She is alive, somewhere in the displaced territory. I have not been able to locate her since." I had not said her name aloud in 3 years. It sat in my mouth with its original weight, not smaller for the saying, but somehow less dense, as if the saying released some compression the holding had built. Captain Osei did not respond immediately. She was still, with the full contact quality of attention she gave to tactical displays. "Okay," she said. "Just that." I waited. "Okay," she said again, and opened the book. I left shortly after. I walked back through the ship past the card game, past the guitar room where 2 crew members were playing something low and warm, and technically imperfect, and I thought about what Captain Osei had described, the half-second between fear and anger, the conversion that had to happen faster than conscious decision. I thought about Orven. Something had been sitting in me for 3 years, quiet and heavy, and this ship and these people were disturbing the stillness around it in a way that nothing else had managed to do. Not removing it, not resolving it, but putting pressure on it in a way that felt different from the professional distance I had been using to manage it. I went back to the mess hall and asked Corporal Tesfaye for another chip. He gave me the whole packet without comment. We ate at the metal table while the sounds of the ship moved around us, and outside the viewport, the Marath corridor was quiet for the first time in 11 years, and the after of each chip arrived and settled, and reminded me, in its small and specific way, that I was still here. The official briefings for the post-Marath period ran across 14 days, and I attended every one, which was not required by my formal assignment, but which had stopped being something anyone remarked on by the 3rd day. The conclave was changing. Not with the sharp redirect of the Marath engagement itself, that single violent correction of institutional trajectory. This change was slower, the kind that happens when a fundamental assumption has been running in a system for a long time and is finally corrected, and the correction moves downstream through every connected process one by one. The vocabulary in the briefing rooms changed first, then the posture of the people in those rooms, then, gradually, the actual plans. I observed this and found it more interesting than I had expected to find it. I had spent 14 years observing conflict situations. I had written detailed analyses of tactical decisions and engagement outcomes. I had spent considerably less time observing the period after an engagement, the way a system absorbs a result and begins to reorganize around it. Humans were particularly instructive in this period. The conclave commanders in the post-Marath briefings spent the first several days processing what had happened, with the cautious thoroughness of people who had experienced something that exceeded their models and were not yet certain what to do with the excess. They asked technical questions. They requested the engagement data. They ran the numbers themselves and got the same numbers, and then ran them again, because the numbers were unsettling in a specific way, the way facts are unsettling when they are definitively true, and also in direct contradiction with what you had been telling yourself. Captain Osei sat in these briefings with the patience of someone who had already had all the arguments with herself, and resolved them, and was now waiting for the room to catch up. She answered questions directly and without condescension. She did not appear to find the delay frustrating. She appeared to find it predictable. I noted this. I noted it because it told me something about how often she had been in rooms where she was waiting for people to arrive at conclusions she already occupied. In the third week, I was sitting across from Corporal Tesfaye in the mess hall, which had become a regular occurrence, and I asked him something I had been thinking about since the Marath engagement. "How do you turn it off?" I said. He looked up from his food. "The combat focus?" "Yes. The going inward. The narrowing. After the engagement, how do you return from that state to this one?" I gestured at the room, the card game, the easy warmth of people in no immediate danger. He thought about it. "It turns off by itself, mostly," he said. "When the threat is gone, the conversion reverses. The fear comes out, like the captain said, and then you're just yourself again. But not immediately." "No," he agreed. "It takes a while. Some people it's an hour. Some people it's a day. You're a little more sensitive to things for a bit. Loud sounds, sudden movements. Your body is still running the threat detection high, even though the threat is over." He ate something. "That's what the card game is for." I looked at the card game in the corner. The card game is a recovery mechanism. "The card game is something to argue about that doesn't matter," he said. "When you're arguing about cards, you're not still in the engagement. You're here, in the mess. The arguing about cards is the proof that you're back." I thought about that. What about the music? I had been hearing the guitar sessions every evening in the small room off the corridor. Is that also a recovery mechanism? "The music is different," he said. "The music is just what Hendrix and Okafor do. They do it whether there's been an engagement or not." He paused. "But I think it helps. You can't really play music and be somewhere else at the same time. The music makes you be here." I ate a chip. The wave arrived and receded. The after settled. "Can I ask you something?" Corporal Tesfaye said. "Yes." "What do Vethari do when they come back from something like that?" I considered the question. Vethari military culture had established recovery protocols that were detailed and codified and built around controlled chromatophore regulation exercises and structured rest periods. I had followed those protocols after difficult field deployments. They were effective, by the measures we used to evaluate effectiveness. "We have formal protocols," I said. "Regulated, structured." He nodded. "And does it work?" I thought about 3 years of touching the navigation console at 2 in the morning. I thought about the documented Vethari recovery literature I had read during that period. All of it accurate, none of it sufficient. "It manages," I said. "I am not certain that is the same thing as working." He looked at me with the careful attention he brought to things that mattered. "Yeah," he said, "there's a difference." In the 4th week, Captain Osei invited me to observe the crew training session. Not the formal drills I had already watched, the weapons reconfiguration practice, the approach sequence rehearsals. Something different. She took me to the section of the Carthage that had been cleared of its standard equipment and had mats arranged on the floor, and for 2 hours, I watched the crew hit each other. "This is imprecise. They were practicing a structured combat discipline that involved a great deal of physical contact, controlled falls, joint locks, and strikes that stopped just short of full impact. They were doing this in pairs, rotating partners, and throughout the session they were making sounds that my matrix classified as communicative in ways that had nothing to do with the content of the words. They were talking while they practiced, correcting each other, commenting on technique, occasionally laughing when something went wrong in an interesting way. They were practicing something that caused pain and discomfort, and they were doing it voluntarily and with apparent enjoyment. Why is this part of training? I asked Captain Osei. We were standing at the edge of the mat area watching Corporal Tesfaye work through a sequence with a much larger crew member named Callum Bryce, who had approximately twice Tesfaye's mass and was currently on the floor looking at the ceiling. Sparring keeps the fear honest, she said. I asked her to explain that. If you only experience threat response in actual combat, it's harder to manage. The scale is wrong. Everything is at maximum all at once, and your body doesn't know how to calibrate. But if you experience smaller versions regularly, in controlled conditions, your body learns the range. You know what high feels like from inside. You know you can come back from it. She watched Brees get up from the floor and immediately go back into the practice stance. And you learn that you can take a hit and keep going. That's probably the most important thing. You can take a hit and keep going, I repeated. Most people's fear of getting hit is worse than the actual getting hit, she said. Once you know what it is, it loses some power over you. I thought about that. You are describing a systematic practice of experiencing the thing you are afraid of in controlled doses. Yes. To reduce the fear? She shook her head. Not to reduce it, to understand it, to know its shape. If you know the shape of a thing, you can plan around it. She watched the practice for a moment. Fear you don't understand is just panic. Fear you understand is information. I watched Corporal Tesfaye and Callum Bryce continue their session. Tesfaye was considerably smaller than Bryce, and was, based on observable outcomes, considerably more effective. He was not stronger. He was reading the situation faster and responding to what was actually happening, rather than to what he expected to happen. He's good, I said. He's patient, Captain Osei said. Which is better? I spent the rest of that day thinking about the difference between patience and passivity, about the way the Carthage had held its approach during the Mareth engagement, threading through fire gaps that required precise timing, which required not firing at the first opportunity, but waiting for the correct one. About how patience, in that context, was not the absence of action, but the discipline to hold the action until the conditions for it were exactly right. About 11 years of conclave perimeter doctrine, which was not patient, which was reactive, which responded to the threat as it presented, rather than positioning itself for the threat as it could be made to present. I filed a supplemental observation report that evening. It was 3 pages. It was the first piece of writing I had produced since arriving on the Carthage that felt like it was describing the actual thing, rather than the outline of the thing. In the 5th week, Lieutenant Petra Okafor found me in the corridor near the observation window at the stern of the ship, and asked if I wanted to hear about soul music. I said I was not familiar with the genre, and she took this as an invitation that required 40 minutes to adequately honor. She sat across from me at the small table by the viewport and explained, with the enthusiasm of someone who has thought about this extensively and has not recently had an audience willing to receive all of it, why soul music was technically perfect, the history of it, the structural elements, the relationship between the vocal performance and the emotional content, the way it carried things that other formats could not carry, things that required a specific combination of pain and beauty and the refusal to separate the two. I listened to all of it. At the end, she played me 2 pieces through the speaker on her device, and I sat with them and felt something that I did not have precise language for, something that my sensory matrix registered as a response to a stimulus that was not threatening and not pleasant in any simple way, something that occupied a register between those categories. You understand why it's technically perfect, she asked. I think, I said carefully, that I understand why it cannot be made any other way. She pointed at me. Yes, that's it. I thought about this later, in my quarters, and about the chip theory Corporal Tesfaye had articulated, the idea that surviving something that tried to hurt you produces a sensation that the absence of the thing cannot produce. Soul music was doing something adjacent to this. It was not trying to produce beauty by removing pain. It was producing beauty by carrying the pain inside the beauty, making them simultaneous, refusing to resolve one into the other. The humans were, I was beginning to understand, very interested in not resolving things prematurely, in letting the difficult thing and the beautiful thing exist in the same space without forcing a conclusion. I wondered if this was connected to the way they handled emotional rupture in general, the exhale on the bridge that came only when the threat was over, the card game that was proof of being back, the sparring that made fear into information, the music that made pain into something you could sit with. In the 6th week I found Captain Ose in her quarters, with the physical book again, and she looked up when I arrived and set it down. "I need to tell you something," she said, before I had a chance to speak. I waited. "The Conclave High Command is moving toward an offensive in Sector 9, she said. "There is a Kreth coordination hub there that our intelligence believes is the central node for the displaced territory network. If it falls, the displacement protocols become unstable and recoverable. The displaced populations, a significant portion of them, could be returned to accessible space." She was watching me with the full contact attention she brought to things that mattered. "I want you on the planning team," she said. "Not as observer, as coordinator. I process this. That is outside my formal assignment. I know. My mandate from the Conclave Observer Corps is documentation and analysis." "I know," she said again. "I am asking you anyway. You understand the Kreth tactical logic better than anyone on this ship. You understand the formation geometry. You understand the history of 11 years of engagement, in a way that is different from understanding it academically." She paused. "I need that understanding at the table, not in a report." I thought about Orven's last known coordinates. I thought about the 60 to 80% projection that I had run through the spatial model in my quarters 3 nights earlier, and had not said aloud to anyone. "What does the 60 to 80% include?" I asked. She did not look away from me. "We do not know the specific distribution," she said. "The displaced territory is extensive, but the projection covers all Vethari populations in the affected systems." I sat with this for a moment. "I will be on the planning team," I said. She nodded. She picked up the book. Then she set it back down. "Sivek," she said. "Yes. Whatever you are not saying about why you agreed, you don't have to say it to me. But you should know that I heard the thing you told me 4 weeks ago, about her. And I want you to know I have not stopped hearing it." I sat very still. "Okay," I said. She opened the book. I left and walked back through the ship, and I thought about patience, about the difference between patience and passivity, about the discipline of holding the action until the conditions for it were exactly right, about how some things you carry for a long time not because you are passive, but because you are waiting for the exact right conditions to act on them. The planning for Sector 9 began the next morning. I was at the table when Admiral Vress arrived, and he looked at me with a slight pause that acknowledged the situation without addressing it directly, and then directed his first question at me, and I answered it, and it continued that way for 6 weeks of planning sessions, and nobody mentioned that my formal mandate had been for documentation and analysis only. The planning sessions were different from anything I had participated in during my previous work with Conclave military operations. Conclave planning sessions operated on a principle I had always accepted as self-evident. The plan that minimizes uncertainty is the best plan. The plan you could predict. The plan that matched the known capabilities of your own forces against the known capabilities of the opposing forces, and found the configuration where your advantages were maximized and your vulnerabilities were minimized. Conclave planning was, fundamentally, the systematic reduction of the unknown. Captain Ose's planning approach was something else. She was not interested in reducing the unknown. She was interested in using it. The unknown, in her framework, was not a threat to be managed. It was an asset. Specifically, the unknown was an asset, because the Kreth could calculate known variables but could not model what they had not observed. The Kreth had never encountered an attack formation shaped like a spear, because no one had ever used one. Therefore, the Kreth had no tactical model for responding to it. Therefore, their response would be slower than it would be if they had seen it before. The unknown that scared the Conclave commanders was, from Captain Ose's perspective, the entire point. I watched this principle work its way through the planning table across 6 weeks. She would propose something. The conclave commanders would object based on the uncertainty. She would explain, with consistent patience, that the uncertainty was not a risk to be mitigated, but an advantage to be deployed. The conclave commanders would argue. She would let them argue until the logic of the position had worked its way through the room. Then the plan would be adopted. She never appeared frustrated by this process. She appeared to find it a predictable element of the work, like weather. In the third week of planning, Corporal Tesfaye found me running approach vector calculations after the evening meal and sat down across from me with 2 chip packets. "You are spending a lot of time at the numbers," he said. "The approach geometry for the hub operation requires careful calibration," I said. He set a chip packet on my console. I took a chip without looking away from the display. The heat arrived and settled. I continued the calibration. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said. I said he could. "The navigator bonded thing," he said. "Is that like a partner? A romantic bond?" I thought about how to answer this. Navigator bonding in Vethari culture was a significant relationship with a specific function. 2 navigators whose neural mapping signatures became calibrated to each other over extended shared assignment, which improved spatial calculation efficiency, but also created a connection that was not purely professional and was not easily described to species that did not have an equivalent. "It is," I said, "the closest thing we have to what I believe you call a partner. It began as professional. It became something that does not have a clean category." He nodded. 3 years, he said. "That is a long time to not know." "Yes. I am sorry," he said, and the way he said it had the specific weight of words that are not looking for a response and do not need one. I ate another chip. "Do you think about her?" he asked, not nosily, gently. "Every day," I said, "usually at 2 in the morning." He looked at the display in front of me, the approach vectors for Sector 9, the hub at the center of the spatial model. "The 60 to 80%, he said. I looked at him. "The recovery projection," he said. "You're checking whether it covers the sector where she was displaced." I was quiet for a moment. "Yes," I said. He ate a chip. He did not offer advice. He did not offer reassurance. He sat across from me at the station while I calibrated approach vectors for an operation that was, underneath all the tactical logic and the planning sessions and the formal coordination meetings, also and fundamentally, an operation I had agreed to be part of, because there was a 60 to 80% projection, and I needed to know what it meant for one specific moon, in one specific sector of displaced Vethari space. "I think," I said finally, "that this is what you mean about the direction, what Captain Osei described, the anger needing a target." He looked at me. "I have been afraid for 3 years," I said. "Not the acute fear of the engagement, a different kind, the kind that does not resolve because there is no action available that would resolve it. I have been holding it without a direction to aim it." I looked at the spatial model on my display, the hub, the Sector 9 coordinates, the approach vectors I had been calibrating for 6 weeks. Now there is a direction. Corporal Tesfaye was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "That's it. That is exactly it." We sat in companionable quiet for a while. The ship moved around us with its ordinary sounds. The ventilation, the distant guitar, the card game in the mess hall. I ran the vectors, and he ate chips, and outside the viewport the stars were the kind of stars that do not know anything about what the small creatures near them are planning, and do not need to. We came out of fold space 12,000 kilometers from the hub, and the Kreth were already forming up. The delay in their defensive spread was narrow, a fractional thing, barely measurable against the engagement projections, but it was there. This force configuration had not been in their models. They were recalculating. They always recalculated. They simply had not yet incorporated the possibility that the conclave would choose to come to them, rather than wait to be approached, that after 11 years of managed retreat, someone would decide that the direction of travel needed to change. We had 7 conclave vessels and the Carthage. The formation was Captain Osei's design, drawn on the planning table in week 2, and argued about for 4 more weeks, and adopted intact. A spear with the Carthage at the point, not a defensive arc, not a perimeter, a directed, penetrating shape that committed to the center rather than managing the edges, that said, the target is the hub and everything else is secondary to reaching it. I was at my coordination station running the approach vector feeds for the 3 middle formation conclave vessels. I had been running those vectors for 6 weeks of planning. I knew them with the specificity that comes from having built them and rebuilt them and stress tested them against every failure scenario I could model. The margin of error in the approach geometry was the smallest I had ever achieved in 14 years of tactical coordination work. The spear moved. For the first 18 minutes, the engagement ran exactly as planned. The Kreth defensive orientation shifted toward the Carthage at the point, which was the design, while the conclave flanking vessels executed the encirclement arc. I was watching the vector feeds and the data was clean. The geometry was holding. The Kreth were responding to the Carthage and not noticing the encirclement until the encirclement was already too far advanced to counter without abandoning the defensive position. It was working. I watched it work and felt something that I would later understand as the particular satisfaction of seeing a thing you helped build function the way you built it to function. Then the Kreth fleet split. I registered the formation change before I understood it. Half the fleet maintained engagement with the Carthage and the spear formation. The other half broke outward on a vector that bypassed the encirclement entirely, and I ran the trajectory projection in under 2 seconds and understood what I was seeing with the kind of clarity that arrives in the worst possible moments. They were not trying to win the engagement. They were going for the hub itself. If the Kreth could collapse the hub from inside rather than surrender it, the displacement protocols would not destabilize in a recoverable way. They would fracture. Every displaced system, every displaced population, scattered on trajectories that would take decades to map and longer to reach. 60 to 80% returned became something that could not be quantified because it could not be found. My coordination station had the intercept vector. The geometry was clear. The path to cut off the Kreth half-fleet before it reached the hub was direct, and the window was open, and the calculation was not complicated. I had run this scenario in the planning sessions. I had run the intercept parameters for exactly this contingency. I knew what to do. I built the solution. I ran the route. I looked at the route. The direct intercept path ran through a sector of space that was in my navigation matrix, under a personal notation I had added 3 years ago, at 2 in the morning, when I was doing the thing I always did at 2 in the morning, which was check the last known coordinates and see if anything had changed. The notation said, Orven's moon, last known vector. I looked at the notation. My matrix was showing me the window closing on the display above the notation. 15 seconds to optimal intercept geometry. 20, until the approach required a harder angle. 30, until the Kreth would be close enough to the hub that the engagement math changed entirely in their favor. My hand did not move. I knew what I was doing. I want to be clear about this. I was not confused about the situation. I was not failing to understand the tactical stakes, or the timeline, or what was needed. I understood every element of it with complete precision. The window, the cost of the delay, the damage to the conclave vessels from the harder approach, the risk to the hub. I understood all of it. I also understood that the direct intercept ran through the last coordinates where Orven had been, and I did not know if she was still there, and I was not moving my hand to confirm the route until I had resolved something I was not capable of resolving in the time available. This is the thing I could not write in the first 10 drafts of my report. Not because I was unwilling to include it, because the words kept coming out wrong. They kept coming out as a failure of professional judgment under emotional pressure, which was accurate, but was not the whole truth of what was happening. The whole truth was this. I had been carrying Orven for 3 years, without a direction to carry her toward. And in the moment when I had a direction and a solution, and a window closing in real time, I froze, at the border of the last coordinate I had for her, the way you stop at the border of the last place someone was, because crossing it means accepting that the crossing is possible, that the geography beyond it is real and accessible, and she might not be in it. This is what fear without a direction feels like from inside, not panic, not incapacity, a kind of paralysis at the exact moment when action is most required. 15 seconds. 20. Captain Osei was there. I had not heard her. She was simply present the way she appeared in situations that required her, without announcement or ceremony. Her eyes moved across my display with the speed and precision I had watched operate many times by now. The solution, the route, The notation in the sector box. Orven's moon, last known vector. She looked at it for exactly as long as she needed. She looked at me. I had nothing to say that would have been adequate in the time available, or in any time after it. I was aware that I had failed a specific professional task at a specific critical moment for a reason I had not disclosed, and that the cost of that failure was now being counted in seconds on the display above me. She reached past me and rebuilt the route. The modified intercept was longer. The conclave flanking vessels would be exposed for an additional 17 seconds of engagement. More expensive, less precise. The geometry was not what I had built in 6 weeks of planning sessions. But it worked. It intercepted the Kreth half-fleet before the hub, and it did not go through the sector I had marked 3 years ago at 2 in the morning. Her hand moved away from my station. She stood beside me for one moment. "Who is she?" Captain Ose asked. Her voice was not loud. Nothing in it was unkind. I did not answer. Not because I was refusing. Because the thing in my chest where the answer lived was not available for language at this specific moment. She nodded. She nodded the way she heard silence, like it was a sentence in a language she had learned and could read. "Okay," she said. She went back to her station. The modified intercept ran. The conclave flanking vessels hit the Kreth half-fleet at the harder angle. Those 17 extra seconds cost us shield damage on 2 vessels and a weapons array on the 3rd, damage I had caused by not moving my hand when the window was clean. I tracked every hit as it registered on my display, and held the accounting of it without putting it down. The Kreth half-fleet was turned back from the hub, not without cost, but turned back. 20 minutes later the hub fell. It fell the way things fall when they have been under sustained targeted pressure for exactly the right duration. Not dramatically. The structural integrity readings on the conclave long-range scanners declined in a curve that was steep and then terminal. The hub's coordination signals stopped propagating across the network. The displaced territory network lost its central management function. And then the recovery projections started running on every screen in the fleet simultaneously. The models trying to calculate what the instability meant, which systems were recoverable, which populations could be located and reached with the displacement protocols now disrupted. The projections updated in real time as more data came in. I was watching my coordination station when the long-range scanner flagged a biosignature. Vethari, strong signal, stable reading. I looked at the coordinates. I sat down on the floor, not with intent, not with any decision being made. My legs arranged themselves on the deck of the bridge of the Carthage, and I was sitting, and the display was still above me, and the biosignature reading was still stable and strong, and the coordinates were coordinates I had been checking at 2 in the morning for 3 years. The floor was cold through my lower integument. I noted this the way you note physical sensations when your higher cognitive processes are occupied with something else. A hand appeared at the edge of my vision holding a chip packet. Petra Okafor, from engineering, sat down on the floor next to me. She did not say anything. She held out the packet. I looked at it. The warning symbol, the extreme heat indicator that I had learned to read as a kind of promise rather than a warning. I took a chip. She took one. We sat on the floor of the bridge of the Carthage, while the crew around us ran their post-engagement work, diagnostics and reports and the careful reconstruction of the situation, and the sounds of that work moved around us like a river, moving around 2 things that had chosen to be still for a moment, and the heat of the chip moved through me, in the wave I now knew the shape of, and the after came. The after. Warm and strange, and more present than neutral. Surviving the thing that tried to hurt you. Surviving 3 years of touching a console at 2 in the morning, and not finding anything, and doing it again tomorrow anyway, because there was nothing else available. Surviving Marath and the planning sessions and 17 extra seconds of exposure on the modified intercept, and the specific paralysis of standing at the last coordinate of someone you need to still be there. The after came. It was not resolution. It was not the end of the wait. It was the first breath on the other side of it, the first moment of knowing that the other side existed and that I was in it, which is different from knowing it intellectually, which is different from running the 60 to 80% through the spatial model and getting a number. This was not a number. Petra Okafor was still sitting next to me on the floor. The chip packet was between us. Outside the viewport, the newly accessible space was doing the ordinary beautiful thing that space does when it is not trying to kill anyone. which is simply existing at enormous scale in complete indifference, and the biosignature signal was holding steady on the scanner above me, stable and strong, the reading of someone who had been in the wrong place for 3 years and was now in a place that could be reached. I ate another chip. She ate one. Above us the bridge continued its work, and the scanner continued its readings, and the hub continued to fall, which is to say, it had already fallen, and the falling was now becoming history, becoming a thing that had happened, that could be referenced and built on, the way every moment that has been survived becomes, eventually, the ground you stand on. I was going to have a great deal of ground to stand on. I stayed on the floor of the bridge for 7 minutes. I counted them, not because the duration mattered, but because counting was something I could do while the higher cognitive processes were otherwise engaged, a simple repetitive task that occupied the surface, while something deeper was doing work I did not have access to. At 7 minutes I stood up. Petra Okafor stood up beside me without comment. She handed me the chip packet. I put it in my coat and went back to my station and ran the post-engagement diagnostic on the vector feeds and filed the preliminary engagement data with the fleet coordination channel. The biosignature signal on the long-range scanner was still there, still stable, still at those coordinates. I did not look at it again during the post-engagement period, not because I was not thinking about it, because I was thinking about nothing else, and looking at it again would not have changed what it said, and I needed my hands to be doing their actual work. Captain Osei found me an hour after the engagement concluded, standing at the viewport in the corridor near the tactical room. She appeared without announcement, as she always did. "You filed your coordination report," she said. "Yes. It includes a notation about the modified intercept route and the additional exposure time on the flanking vessels." "It is accurate to include it." "It is," she said. "I am not questioning the notation." She stood beside me at the viewport for a moment. "I am telling you that I read it, and I wanted you to know." I said nothing. "You did your job," she said. The modification worked. The outcome was correct. The outcome was correct, I agreed. I caused 17 extra seconds of exposure on the flanking vessels by not acting in the available window. "Yes," she said. I waited for more, and she did not produce it. She was not going to tell me the 17 seconds were acceptable, or that the outcome justified the process, or that I should not hold the accounting I had been holding. She was simply stating the fact, and acknowledging that I had stated it too, and leaving space for both of those things to be true simultaneously. I thought about what she had said about soul music, which she had not said, but which Petra Okafor had explained to me, and which I had been thinking about since. "You cannot produce the beauty by removing the pain. You carry them together." "The biosignature," I said. "It is holding stable." "I know," she said. "I have been watching it." I looked at her. "Of course I have," she said. I looked back at the viewport. The stars outside were ordinary stars. The dark between them was ordinary dark. Nothing about the spatial geometry of what I was looking at had changed because of what I now knew about what it contained. But I was looking at it differently. There was a moon out there in the accessible space that had not been accessible this morning. There was a stable biosignature at coordinates I had been checking at 2 in the morning for 3 years. The space was the same space, and I was looking at it from the other side of a thing I had been living inside for 3 years. And from the other side, the space looked the same, but the looking was different. "What happens now?" I asked. The question was not specifically about the engagement or the recovery operation, or the conclave's next moves. It was larger than all of those. "Now we go get them," Captain Osei said. Simply, as if this was the obvious next step, and the only relevant question was which vessel to dispatch and on what timeline. Which, I supposed it was. The medical transports were dispatched within 48 hours. The recovery operation was organized with the kind of efficient care that the conclave applied to things it had decided mattered, which was a different energy from the conclave I had been observing for the past 14 years. Something had shifted in the institutional orientation. The direction, to use the language I was developing for my report, had changed. I was assigned to the first transport. Captain Osei walked me to the docking collar. Her crew was there, some of them, the ones whose shifts allowed it. Corporal Tesfaye, Petra Okafor, Lieutenant Hendricks, who had stopped playing the guitar long enough to be present. They did not make a ceremony of it. They were simply there, in the corridor. In the easy, unstructured way they occupied spaces together. "Come back and tell us what you figure out," Captain Osei said. I told her I intended to. She shook my tentacle cluster, firmly, once. The transport pulled away from the Carthage, and I stood at the viewport and watched the ship grow smaller in the frame, and then become a point among points, and then become indistinguishable from the ordinary stars around it, which was appropriate, because it was a ship, and ships look like stars from sufficient distance. But I knew which one it was. I watched until I could not distinguish it anymore, and then I watched the space where it had been, which looked exactly like the space around it, and I thought about the painted face on the hull, with all its teeth showing, and the Jolene song in the key of D major, and Corporal Tesfaye's chip theory, and the 40 minutes of soul music education, and the specific quality of attention Captain Osei brought to silence. I thought about direction, about having one, about what it feels like, after 3 years without one, to be moving towards something you need to find. The transport carried 42 people on the recovery mission, and I was the only Vethari among them, and they were, all of them, very warm and very loud, and the food in the mess was not what I was accustomed to, and they played card games in the evenings that were exactly as contentious as the card games on the Carthage, which I found reassuring, in a way I did not examine too carefully. On the third day, a crew member named Felix Addo sat down across from me in the mess and offered me something from a packet with a warning symbol on it. I took one. The wave arrived. The after settled. I was still here. I spent 12 days on the medical transport. I am not going to write in detail about those 12 days. They belong to a different account than this one. What I will say is that Orven was changed, as I was changed, in ways that 3 years in the wrong place makes inevitable. She looked at me on the first day with eyes that held a particular quiet damage, and I recognized it because I was looking at her with the same eyes. We had both been carrying something very heavy for a long time, and the putting down of it was not clean or simple or fast. It does not work that way. It begins somewhere and then continues in ways that keep surprising you months later. But it began. Beginning is the thing. I returned to the Carthage 6 weeks after the hub fell. The conclave in this period was becoming something different. Not a dramatic redirection. A gradual reorganization around a corrected assumption, the way a river changes course when the obstruction that was shaping it is removed. It does not change overnight. It changes the way living systems change, slowly and incompletely, and in ways that are only visible in retrospect. The planning meeting vocabulary had changed. The people in the rooms held their shoulders differently. Admiral Vress had used the phrase, "Why not go through the middle," in a formal briefing, which 6 months ago would not have appeared in formal conclave military communication, and no one had remarked on it, which was itself a remark on how far things had moved. I had been formally requested to submit the complete observer's report, the classified assessment for the Conclave Intelligence Archive, the document that would be referenced for decades by analysts looking for the sentence that explained what humanity was, and what they represented, and how the conclave should think about them. I wrote 11 drafts. The first draft said the humans were an aggressive species, with exceptional tactical instincts and a high threshold for operational risk, which was accurate, and would have told anyone who read it exactly nothing they needed to know. The second draft said the humans were a predator species, with retained combat optimization responses from a pre-sapient evolutionary period, which was more accurate and equally useless as a description of what they actually were in practice. The third draft attempted to describe the Marath engagement in formal tactical terms and ran to 14 pages, and at the end of 14 pages I still had not said the thing that needed to be said. The fourth draft tried to describe the fear-to-anger conversion in clinical language, and ended up reading like an analysis of a malfunction, rather than a description of the most sophisticated threat response architecture I had encountered in 14 years. The fifth and sixth drafts I deleted halfway through, for reasons that seemed clear at the time, and are harder to articulate now, something to do with the tone being wrong, in ways I could not correct by revision. The seventh draft began with a sentence I had not planned. I wrote it without deciding to write it, the way you write things that have been waiting longer than you realized. The sentence said, "The humans are afraid." I stopped. I read it back. I read it back again. I did not delete it. The 8th draft became, without my intending this, a document about Orven, about 3 years of navigation consoles at 2 in the morning, about sitting on the floor of a bridge. It was accurate and personal, and completely inappropriate for the intelligence archive, and I deleted it, but I kept a copy, because some things need to be written regardless of where they end up. The 9th draft was too long in all the wrong places. The 10th draft was almost right, 4 pages, organized and complete and accurate, and still missing the central thing, the thing that everything else was context for. The thing it was missing sat with me for 2 more days. Then I went and found Captain Osei. She was in her quarters with the physical book. She looked up when I appeared in the doorway and set the book down. "How is she?" she asked. "Changed," I said. "As I am. But here." She nodded. "Sit down." I sat. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to tell me if I have understood it correctly." She put the book face down on the table. "Go ahead." "I have been writing this report for 3 weeks," I said. "The official assessment, what humans are, what you represent, what the conclave needs to understand about you. I have written 10 versions, and they all fail in the same way. They describe everything you do. They do not explain why. What is the why?" "For the entire assignment," I said, "I have been trying to understand what makes humans function the way you function under threat. I identified the fear-to-anger conversion. I documented the tactical results. I cataloged the behavioral patterns. All of that is accurate, and none of it is the center of the thing." I looked at her. I was describing the output and missing the engine. "What is the engine?" "The fear itself," I said. "Not the anger. The fear. I organized it. You are the most afraid species I have encountered. Not slightly more afraid than others. More afraid by a distance I cannot accurately measure with the instruments I have available. You evolved in an environment that was actively and consistently trying to end you, and the fear response that environment produced in your species was not smaller or more manageable than what other species carry. It was larger, and more immediate, and more physical. You feel fear with your whole body, in a way that most conclave species process only in the higher cognitive functions." She was completely still. "By every model I can apply," I said, "a species that afraid should not be functional under threat. The fear response should be overwhelming. You should be extinct, or you should have retreated from threat so comprehensively that you never developed the capacity to meet it directly, and yet you are sitting across from me, having just participated in the operation that turned a Kreth fleet for the 2nd time in 3 months. And yet," she said. "At some point," I said, "enough of your ancestors were in enough impossible situations that they developed a conversion, not a solution to the fear, an addition. The fear arrives at its full intensity, and then, in the half-second before it can overwhelm the executive function, it is converted into something with a direction. Something that picks a target. Something that moves toward the threat rather than away from it. Not because the fear is gone, but because the fear has been given something to aim at. And an aim is movement, and movement is survival." I paused. "You have been doing this for 100,000 years. Every fear converted into direction. Every direction aimed at something specific. The something specific is never abstract. It is always a person. Someone you are not going to let disappear." The room was very quiet. "That is what I could not write," I said. "Not because I did not want to include it. Because every attempt to put it in formal intelligence language came out wrong. It came out as a clinical description of a mechanism, when what it actually is a description of what you have decided to do with the worst thing you carry." Captain Osei looked at the book on the table for a moment. Then she looked at me. "How are you going to write it?" she said. "I am going to say that you are not brave in any sense I can recognize," I said. "Brave implies the management of fear, or the decision to act despite it. You are something without a word in Vethari. You are afraid, completely and correctly afraid, and you convert it faster than anything I have ever observed, and the conversion always produces a direction, and the direction always has a name attached to it." She was quiet. "I am going to say that the direction is the whole thing," I said. 11 years of conclave perimeter doctrine was a doctrine without direction. It managed threat, it minimized loss, it preserved assets, but it did not have something it was aimed toward. It was organized around avoiding outcomes rather than achieving them. You don't fight that way. No, she said, we don't. You fight towards something, I said. The center of the formation. The hub. The specific person in the displaced territory. You pick the thing you are moving toward, and the fear converts into the fuel for moving toward it, and you go. She looked at the viewport beside her table for a long moment. The stars outside were ordinary, and indifferent, and completely unchanged by anything that had happened in the past months, which was correct, because stars do not have opinions about what the small creatures near them decide to do. Are you going to put all of that in the report? She asked. I am going to try, I said. Some of it resists formal intelligence language, and I am going to have to find different language for those parts. What does the chip theory translate to? I considered it. A species that has systematically practiced surviving discomfort in order to develop tolerance for larger discomforts, and that experiences the survival itself as a positive outcome independent of any other benefit, is a species that will not stop trying things that might hurt them, because the trying and the surviving is itself the thing they are after. I paused. In practical terms, this means that you do not learn from painful outcomes the way most species learn from them, which is to say, you do not stop. You adjust and try again. The Kreth thought we'd stop, she said. When they held and calculated, they were calculating for a species that learns don't do that from a painful outcome. Yes, I said. And you do not. No, she said. We learn how to do it better. This was, I understood, the last sentence I needed for the report. Not because it was the most important sentence, but because it was the sentence that all the other sentences were context for. I left Captain Osei's quarters and went back to my station, and I wrote the 11th draft. It was 8 pages. It covered the tactical record, the behavioral observations, the engagement analyses, the fear conversion architecture, the chip theory, and what it implied about learning and adaptation, the hub operation, the recovery outcomes. It was accurate and complete, and in the language of the intelligence archive, except for the 2 paragraphs at the end, which I marked as classified, for senior command eyes only. The first classified paragraph said, "The primary source of strength in the human military unit is attachment to specific individuals within and adjacent to the unit. This is not incidental to their function. It is the mechanism of their function. The fear converts into direction, and the direction always points toward a person. Do not attempt to use this as a vulnerability. Attempting to use it will produce the most concentrated and precisely aimed version of the fear conversion response this species can generate." The force that made the Kreth retreat twice in 3 months was operating at standard attachment levels. This is the note before the warning. The warning is, do not become the thing they are aimed at. The second classified paragraph said, recommend full partnership at every level, full resource sharing, full strategic integration, full trust. They will extend it first, without requiring proof of reciprocation, because that is how they are built, and how they have survived, and how they will continue to survive. We should not waste it. I submitted the report at 8 minutes past midnight, which is not a time that carries significance in the conclave calendar, but which happened to be a time when I was finished with it and felt no reason to wait. My supervisor's response arrived in 6 minutes, which was faster than anything he had sent me in 14 years of working together. It said, "We have a great many questions." I sent back 1 sentence. The answers are in the document. Read the classified section at least twice. Then I went to the mess hall. Corporal Tesfaye was there, which was not surprising. Petra Okafor was there, and Lieutenant Hendricks, and 3 other crew members I had come to know well enough that their faces in the mess at midnight felt like a normal and expected part of the world. Corporal Tesfaye looked up when I came in, and did not say anything. He reached into his cargo pocket and set a chip packet on the table. I sat down. I took a chip. The wave arrived in the familiar way, the heat moving through the sensory channels in the pattern I now knew from enough repetitions to recognize as distinctly itself, different from every other sensation in the specific way that things are when you have learned their shape. The wave peaked. The wave receded. The after settled, warm and specific, the warmth of having been through something, and arrived on the other side of it still intact. The warmth that is not the absence of the wave, but what the wave leaves behind in the channels it moved through. Something cleared, something present. The reminder, specific and physical, and exactly its own weight, that you are still here. I looked at the chip packet on the table. I looked at the crew around me. doing the ordinary things of people who have decided to be alive and are getting on with it. I thought about Orvin on the transport, asking me what the humans were like. Loud, I had told her, and warm. They eat things that hurt them on purpose. They put their hands on walls when they need something to hold. They argue about card games as proof of being present. They play music in small rooms every evening, and they do not need anyone to hear it. And she had asked, "Are they going to be all right?" I had not answered immediately. I had sat with it the way I had been learning to sit with things, without requiring them to resolve faster than they resolved naturally. Then I had said, yes, and she had asked how I knew, and I had told her the truth, which was that I did not know it the way you know a calculation. I knew it the way you know the after of the chip, the way you know that you can take the wave and come through it, and still be here on the other side, not unchanged, not undamaged, but here, which is the thing that matters, which is the only thing that matters, when you look at it from the inside. They had been taking the wave for 100,000 years. They had always come through. Outside the viewport, the stars did their ordinary work of existing at enormous scale, and the dark between them was the same dark it had always been, unchanged by anything that small creatures in its vicinity decided about themselves. But the small creatures were deciding things. That was the whole point. That was, I understood finally, the sentence that the 10 failed drafts had been reaching for. Not a tactical assessment, not a biological profile, not a threat classification, or an alliance recommendation, or an analysis of the fear-to-anger conversion, or the chip theory, or the specific mathematics of going through the middle instead of around the edges. The sentence was, the small creatures are deciding things. And the things they are deciding are, we are not going to stop. We are going to adjust and try again. We are going to pick something worth moving toward, and convert everything into the fuel for moving toward it, and keep going until we get there, or until something stops us, and nothing has stopped us yet. By the dim, nothing has stopped them yet. I stayed in the mess hall until 2 in the morning. This was not unusual. I had, across the months on the Carthage, learned to occupy that hour differently than I had occupied it before. The 2 in the morning hour, which had been the hour of checking coordinates and finding the same absence and closing the console and trying to sleep, had become something else without my entirely deciding to change it. It had become the hour of the mess hall, the chip packet, the low voices of crew members who also happened to be awake at 2 in the morning for reasons of their own that they did not always say. At 2 in the morning, people say things that they do not say at other hours. Not secrets, necessarily, just things that require the particular quality of quiet that 2 in the morning produces, the quality of being in a small warm space while the rest of the world is somewhere else. Corporal Tesfaye told me about his family on one of those nights. His mother was a mathematics teacher in a city I had looked up afterward, and found to be in a part of the human homeworld that was described as very green, which I had cross-referenced with the visual archive and found to be accurate. His father repaired instruments, musical and mechanical, a combination of precision and care that Tesfaye spoke about with a specific kind of pride, the kind that comes from recognizing in a parent something you have also found in yourself. I told him about Orven, the navigator bonding, what it meant, how it had developed across the first years of shared assignment from something professional into something that did not have a category, how I had learned to read the spatial geometry of the places we had worked in, partly through her perspective on it, because her spatial intuition was different from mine, and the difference was useful, and across years of working together, our approaches had become integrated in ways that meant I could run calculations, now that I could not have run before I knew her. He listened to all of it, with the specific quality of attention he brought to things that mattered. You're a better navigator because of her, he said. Yes. That's the best kind of thing to be able to say about someone, he said. That they made you better at the thing you care most about. I thought about this for a while, about the ways the Carthage had made me better at things I cared about, the tactical understanding I now carried that I had not had before, the framework for thinking about fear and direction that had reorganized how I read every conflict situation I would encounter afterward, the chip theory, which was small but true in the way that small true things often prove more durable than large complicated ones, the specific capacity, which I had not had before and now had, to sit down on the floor of a bridge in a moment of crisis and accept a chip from someone who understood, without being told what the sitting down on the floor meant, and what the chip was offering. These were not things in any formal report. They were things you could not put in a formal report without changing the category of the document entirely. They were, I was coming to understand, what the document was actually about. Underneath the 8 pages of formal intelligence assessment, and the classified paragraphs, and the tactical analyses, the document was about what you learn from fighting alongside creatures who have decided to do something with the worst thing they carry. What you learn about your own worst things. What you discover is possible on the other side of the moment when your hand does not move and someone reaches past you and corrects the route and does not require you to explain. Tesfaye went to bed at 3 in the morning, and I stayed at the table with the remaining chips and the viewport, and the 2 in the morning quality of the empty mess, and the thought that I was going home soon, that the assignment had ended, that Orven was recovering and I was going to be there while she recovered, and that the work of putting down something held for 3 years was going to continue in the way that work continues, imperfectly and slowly, and in ways that keep surprising you. I thought about the navigation console, about touching it, about the habit of checking coordinates at 2 in the morning that had been, for 3 years, the only available action, and therefore the action I took, regardless of whether it helped. I had not touched the navigation console at 2 in the morning for the past 6 weeks. I did not know exactly when it had stopped. It had simply become, at some point, a thing I was no longer doing, replaced by the mess hall, and the chips, and the card game arguments, and the 2 in the morning conversations that said things that required the particular quiet of that hour to be said. The navigation console was still there. I had not needed to stop touching it because I had found something else to do with that hour. And finding something else to do with an hour is the way you stop doing the thing you were doing with it before. This was, I thought, related to the chip theory. You do not remove the discomfort. You survive it, and the surviving produces something, and you carry that something into the next thing, and eventually the carrying of the something becomes what you are doing, instead of the thing you were doing before. I filed one final supplemental note to my report at 3:40 in the morning. It was not in the formal section. It was in the personal observations appendix that the Observer Corps included in their standard template for extended field assignments, which was rarely used because most observers did not accumulate personal observations that warranted formal documentation. The note said, "The most important thing I observed in 14 months on the Carthage was not a tactical principle, or a behavioral pattern, or a physiological mechanism. It was this: the humans extend trust before it is earned, and do not require reciprocation as a condition of extending it further. This is not naivety. They have been betrayed. They know the full range of what trust costs. They extend it anyway, because they have learned, through 100,000 years of surviving things that tried to stop them, that the things worth doing require it. They are not reckless. They are precise about what they offer, and to whom they offer it. But when they offer it completely. I recommend that we receive this with the care it deserves." I submitted the note. I went to bed. In the morning I packed my equipment and walked to the docking collar, where the transport that would take me to the Vethari medical facility, where Orven was recovering, was waiting. The corridor was quiet at this hour. The ship had the particular quality that ships have in the early morning, the quality of things being at rest that are usually in motion. Captain Osei was at the docking collar. She was alone. She was wearing the informal uniform rather than the command one, which meant she had come directly from wherever she had been, rather than making a ceremony of it. She looked at me with the attention she brought to things that mattered, and did not say anything for a moment. Then she extended her hand. I took it and pressed firmly, once, and released. Startlingly warm. I had not forgotten, but it was still startling. "Come back and tell us what you figure out," she said. "I intend to," I said. She nodded. She put her hands in her pockets and walked back down the corridor toward the bridge. I watched her until she turned the corner. Then I stepped into the docking collar, and the transport sealed behind me. I stood at the viewport as we pulled away from the Carthage, and watched the ship in the frame until it was a point among points, and then part of the ordinary darkness around it. I knew which one it was. I would know which one it was for a long time. The transport was carrying me toward Orven, and toward the work of putting something down that had been carried for 3 years. And outside the viewport, the stars were doing their ordinary work in their ordinary silence, and I thought about direction, and about what it costs, and what it is worth, and about the small creatures deciding things in the dark that they had no guarantee anyone was watching. I had a chip packet in my coat pocket. Felix Addo had given it to me on the recovery transport 3 weeks ago, and I had been carrying it since. Warning symbol on the outside. Extreme heat indicator. I took one out. The wave arrived. The after settled. Still here.